Brothers and sisters, let me take you back to the 9th year after the Hijrah. By this point, so much had already happened. Makkah had been conquered. The idols around the Kaaba had been shattered. Hunain had been fought and won. Delegations from across Arabia were arriving in Medina, tribe after tribe, to accept Islam. If you were living in that time, you might have thought the hardest days were behind the Ummah. You might have thought the Prophet ﷺ and his companions had earned a season of rest, a moment to breathe, to enjoy the fruits of years of struggle and sacrifice. And yet, that is precisely when the greatest test of this era arrived, because that is how Allah operates. He does not allow comfort to settle into the hearts of believers for too long. Just when we think we have arrived, He reminds us that the journey of faith never truly ends until we meet Him. News reached Medina that the Byzantine Empire, the great Roman power of the north, was mobilizing its forces. This was not some small tribe or a local skirmish. This was the mightiest military power known to the Arabs at that time, a civilization with wealth, with organized armies, with centuries of conquest behind it. And the report was that they were gathering at the borders of Syria, possibly to march against the Muslims in Medina. Now put yourself in that moment. You are not being asked to defend your own city. You are being asked to march out, deep into unfamiliar territory, hundreds of miles away, to confront an empire that had crushed nations before you. This alone should tell you the scale of what was being asked. But it was not simply the enemy that made this expedition unbearable. It was the timing. This call came during the peak of summer, when the heat in the Arabian Peninsula becomes almost unbearable, when the sun sits directly overhead and the ground itself seems to burn beneath your feet. And it came at harvest time, when the date palms were heavy with fruit, when the farmers of Medina had spent an entire year waiting for this very season, the season where their labor would finally pay off. Can you imagine? You have watered your fields, you have tended your crops through drought and dust, and now, just as the dates are ripening, just as the shade of your orchard calls you to sit and enjoy what you have worked so hard for, a call comes. Leave all of this behind and march toward the unknown. This is why the historians and scholars of the Sirah refer to this expedition by a special name. They call it Ghazwat al-Usra, the expedition of hardship. Not the expedition of victory, not the expedition of glory, but the expedition of hardship. Because everything about it was difficult. The distance was difficult. The heat was difficult. The timing was difficult. The scarcity of provisions was difficult. There are narrations that describe how some of the companions had so little that a group of men would share a single date between them, sucking on it for its moisture, and then passing it to the next person, simply to have something to wet their tongues in that punishing heat. Water itself became a luxury. Some of the companions reportedly had to slaughter their camels, simply to extract the liquid from inside their stomachs to survive the thirst. This is the level of hardship we are speaking about. And here is something remarkable that I want you to sit with for a moment. In almost every other expedition throughout the life of the Prophet ﷺ, he would use strategy. He would announce that the army was heading in one direction while secretly planning to march in another. This was standard practice, a matter of military wisdom, so that the enemy could not prepare, so that spies could not relay false or true information back to the opposing side. But with Tabuk, something changed. This time the Prophet ﷺ stood before the people and told them plainly, "We are marching against the Romans." He named the destination. He named the enemy. He explained the difficulty that lay ahead. Why would he do this when concealment had always been the wiser military tactic before? Think about it deeply, because this is where the first real lesson of this entire expedition begins to unfold. By announcing everything so openly, the Prophet ﷺ removed every illusion. There was no pretending this would be an easy raid. There was no hope of quick and abundant war booty, as there sometimes was in smaller battles closer to home. There was no possibility of a companion joining half-heartedly, thinking perhaps this would be a short excursion with an easy return. Everyone knew from the very beginning exactly what they were signing up for. A long, brutal, dangerous march against the greatest empire of the age, in the worst possible heat, at the worst possible time of year. And in doing this, the Prophet ﷺ created something extraordinarily pure. He created a filter. He created a situation where only sincerity could carry a person forward. There was no room left for those who wanted the appearance of faith without the substance of it. If you showed up to march to Tabuk, everyone understood, including yourself, that you were doing it purely and solely because you believed, because you trusted Allah and His messengers and for no other reason. This is something I want every single one of us to reflect upon in our own lives. How often do we do good deeds when they are easy, when they are comfortable, when there is some visible reward attached to them, some recognition, some benefit we can point to? And how often do we shy away the moment sincerity is truly tested, the moment the deed requires something from us with absolutely nothing tangible in return? Tabuk teaches us that the truest measure of faith is not what we do when it is convenient. It is what we do when every single worldly incentive points us towards staying home. And yet we still rise, we still prepare, we still march forward. Because our hearts are attached to something greater than comfort, something greater than this fleeting world. Now, brothers and sisters, when this call went out, the response of the sincere believers was breathtaking. Despite the heat, despite the harvest, despite the distance, despite the fear that any reasonable person would feel standing before the prospect of facing the Roman army, the companions began to prepare. They brought what they had, they sold what they could. Entire families pooled together whatever resources existed in their homes just to make sure that a father, a son, a brother could be equipped to march. This was not an army of professional soldiers with endless supply chains behind them. This was an army built from the sacrifice of ordinary people who had almost nothing to begin with, giving everything they had. But alongside this beautiful sincerity, something else was happening in the shadows. And this is where our story takes a turn that I think every one of us needs to hear very carefully, because it speaks directly to something that exists in every community, in every era, including our own. There was a group of people in Medina who outwardly claimed to be believers but whose hearts had never truly accepted faith. The Quran calls them the munafiqun, the hypocrites. And when the call to Tabuk went out, these individuals faced a dilemma. Marching to Tabuk meant real hardship, real risk, real sacrifice, and they had no genuine desire to endure any of it. But refusing outright, openly declaring that they would not join the Messenger of Allah in this expedition, would expose them for what they truly were. So instead, they did something far more insidious. They began to construct excuses. Now here is what fascinates me about this part of the story, and I want you to really absorb this. These were not crude, obviously dishonest excuses. These were carefully worded, seemingly reasonable justifications. The kind that could be presented with a straight face, the kind that could almost convince even the person saying them. One man approached the Prophet ﷺ and said, essentially, do not put me to trial, allow me to remain behind. For I fear that if I see the fair-skinned women of the Romans, I might fall into temptation. Think about the audacity of this excuse. He frames his refusal to fight in the path of Allah as though it were an act of piety, as though he were protecting his own faith by staying home, when in reality, he simply did not want to endure the difficulty of the journey. He dressed cowardice in the clothing of righteousness. Others complained bitterly about the heat. They said openly to one another, do not march out in this scorching sun. They discouraged their fellow townsmen. They whispered among the ranks, trying to plant seeds of doubt and reluctance in the hearts of those who might otherwise have joined. Some claimed they needed to stay behind for business reasons, for family obligations, for 100 different justifications that on the surface sounded practical, sounded responsible even, but which in truth were simply thin coverings over an unwillingness to sacrifice for the sake of Allah. And here, brothers and sisters, is where the story takes an extraordinary turn, one that should send a chill down the spine of anyone who has ever tried to disguise their own shortcomings behind clever justification. Allah, the Most High, did not leave these excuses unanswered in silence. He revealed verses of the Quran directly addressing what these individuals had said in private, in secret gatherings, in conversations they believed no one else had heard. Imagine that. A man complains quietly to his friend about the heat, thinking it is nothing more than an offhand comment between two people, and within a short while, a revelation comes down from the heavens, exposing that very comment, informing the man, and all of Medina, and indeed all of humanity until the end of time, that the fire of the hereafter is far more intense in its heat than anything they could imagine avoiding in this world. What they thought was a private complaint became a public lesson recited in the Quran for the next 1400 years and beyond. This chapter of the Quran, Surah At-Tabuk, came to be known among the companions by another name, Al-Fadiha, the Exposer, because that is precisely what it did. It exposed. It pulled back the curtain on hearts that had spent months, sometimes years, hiding behind outward displays of religiosity. Every excuse that was whispered in secret found its way into the open record of revelation. Every justification that a hypocrite believed had gone unnoticed was, in fact, being recorded and would be announced before the entire community. I want you to sit with the weight of this for a moment, because I believe there is a profound lesson here that touches every one of us, in every generation, not only the people of that time. How many of us construct excuses for ourselves? Quiet justifications we whisper only to our closest circle, or perhaps only in the privacy of our own hearts, believing that no one will ever know the true reason behind our reluctance to do what Allah has asked of us. We convince ourselves that our excuse is reasonable, that it is even righteous, that surely Allah would understand why we could not fast today, why we could not give in charity this month, why we could not stand for prayer, why we could not forgive, why we could not sacrifice something we hold dear for the sake of something greater. And yet Tabuk teaches us something sobering. Nothing is truly hidden from Allah. The excuses we think are private are known to Him in full detail, down to the very wording we used in our own minds. What was whispered among a small circle in Medina became eternal Quran. What we whisper to ourselves today is known just as completely to the one who knows what is concealed in every heart. But let us not dwell only on the hypocrites, because the true beauty of this expedition lies in the contrast, in the sheer difference between those who made excuses and those who did not. While one group was busy constructing elaborate justifications for staying behind, another group was busy giving away everything they owned simply for the honor of being included in this march. While one group whispered about the heat, another group welcomed the heat as an opportunity to prove where their loyalty truly stood. This is the real power of the story of Tabuk. It is not simply a historical account of an expedition that never resulted in battle. It is a mirror. It is a mirror that Allah placed before the Ummah, so that in every era, every believer could look into it and ask themselves honestly, which group do I belong to? Am I someone who finds a reason to give, to serve, to sacrifice, even when it costs me something real? Or am I someone who finds a reason to excuse myself, dressing my hesitation in language that sounds noble but is, underneath, simply an unwillingness to be inconvenienced for the sake of my faith? And I want to be very clear here, because this is important. Sincerity was not only shown through action. It was shown through the anguish some companions felt when they genuinely could not go. There is a difference, and it is a difference the Quran itself draws out with great precision, between someone who has a genuine excuse and grieves over their inability to participate, and someone who fabricates an excuse simply to avoid the difficulty. Both may end up staying behind in Medina, but their hearts are worlds apart. One heart aches with longing, wishing desperately that circumstances were different, wishing they too could be marching under that punishing sun toward Tabuk. The other heart feels relief, feels a quiet satisfaction at having escaped hardship while maintaining the appearance of piety. Allah sees straight through to which heart is which, regardless of what the outward situation looks like. This is perhaps one of the most beautiful and most sobering realizations to draw from this moment in the seerah. It is not always about whether you can physically do something. It is about the disposition of your heart toward the command of Allah. A person who is genuinely unable to fulfill an obligation, but whose heart yearns for it, whose eyes fill with tears at being left behind, is in an entirely different spiritual position than a person who is fully capable but manufactures a clever reason to escape responsibility. The outward action might look similar. Both remain at home. But in the sight of Allah, the difference between them is immense, because Allah does not merely judge the deed. He judges the heart behind the deed. Now I ask you, brothers and sisters, to bring this closer to home, to bring it into our own lives today, because the value of the seerah is not in simply knowing the history. The value is in allowing these stories to reshape how we live. How many times has an obligation come our way, whether it be a duty toward our parents, a responsibility toward our community, an act of charity that our circumstances quietly called for, an opportunity to stand up for what is right when it was uncomfortable to do so? And how many times have we, instead of stepping forward, quietly constructed our own version of the excuses of Tabuk? Perhaps we did not say, "Do not put me to trial before the fair-skinned women of the Romans." But perhaps we said something equally self-serving in our own context. Perhaps we said, "I am too busy," when in truth we simply did not want to be inconvenienced. Perhaps we said, "Someone else will handle it," when in truth we were avoiding the discomfort of responsibility. Perhaps we said, "It is not the right time," when in truth there would never be a right time in our own minds, because the real issue was never timing, it was willingness. The heat of Tabuk is a metaphor that extends far beyond a single military campaign in the 9th year of Hijrah. It represents every form of hardship that stands between a believer and the fulfillment of what Allah has asked of them. For some of us, the heat of Tabuk is financial sacrifice, the discomfort of giving generously when our own resources feel stretched thin. For others, it is social discomfort, the fear of what people will think of us if we stand firmly upon a principle that is unpopular. For others still, it is simply the discomfort of routine, the difficulty of waking for prayer when sleep feels far more inviting, the difficulty of controlling our tongue when anger feels far more satisfying, the difficulty of patience when impulsiveness feels far more immediate. In every one of these situations, we face our own miniature Tabuk. And in every one of these situations, we have the same choice that stood before the people of Medina. Do we construct an excuse, however reasonable it may sound to our own ears, or do we push forward with sincerity, trusting that the discomfort we endure for the sake of Allah is never wasted? I want to remind you also of what this expedition reveals about the mercy and the wisdom of Allah in how He deals with His creation. He did not simply condemn the hypocrites and move on. He gave humanity, through the revelation of these verses, a permanent lesson, a permanent warning, so that every generation after them would have the opportunity to recognize these patterns within themselves before it was too late. This is an act of profound mercy. Allah exposed the hypocrites of that era, yes, but in doing so, He protected countless generations after them from falling into the same trap unknowingly. Every time we read these verses, every time we reflect on the excuses that were made and exposed, we are being given a chance that those particular hypocrites, once exposed, could no longer fully benefit from. We have the advantage of hindsight. We know how this story played out. We know that the excuses did not save anyone from accountability. We know that whispering something quietly does not mean it goes unrecorded. And with this knowledge available to us, we are left with less excuse than they had, because we have been shown so clearly where that path leads. There is one more dimension to this that I think deserves our attention, and it is the psychological toll of hypocrisy itself. Consider the position these individuals put themselves in. They had to maintain a facade in public, appearing pious, appearing committed to the community, while internally resisting every call to genuine sacrifice. This is an exhausting way to live. A sincere believer, even one who struggles, even one who sins and repents and struggles again, experiences a certain peace because there is honesty in their relationship with Allah. But a person who is constantly constructing excuses, constantly performing faith without truly living it, exists in a state of perpetual internal conflict. Their outward words say one thing, their inward reality says another, and the gap between the two grows heavier with every excuse they add to it. This is, in many ways, its own punishment, separate entirely from whatever consequence awaits in the hereafter. There is no rest for a heart that is constantly managing the distance between what it shows and what it truly is. And so, brothers and sisters, when we look back at Ghazwat al-Usra, the expedition of hardship, and specifically at this first great lesson within it, the lesson of sincere sacrifice standing in stark contrast against empty excuses, I want you to walk away from this not simply informed but changed. I want the next time an obligation calls you, and your mind instinctively begins searching for a reason to step back, for you to pause and ask yourself, is this a genuine excuse? One that grieves my heart because I truly wish I could do more? Or is this the whisper of convenience dressing itself up as wisdom? Because Allah heard every excuse whispered in the alleyways of Medina, and Allah hears every excuse whispered in the quiet corners of our own minds today. Nothing has changed in this regard. The heat may look different in our lives. It may not be the sun of the Arabian desert. It may be the heat of a difficult decision, a costly sacrifice, an uncomfortable truth we must speak, or a comfort we must give up. But the test remains exactly the same as it was for those who stood at the edge of Medina preparing to march toward Tabuk. Will we let the heat stop us, or will we let our sincerity carry us through it? Let me pause here and speak plainly about something that I think we often overlook when we study this part of the Seerah. We tend to imagine the hypocrites of Medina as distant figures, almost cartoonish in their deceit, easy to identify, easy to separate ourselves from. We read their excuses and we shake our heads thinking, how could anyone say something so transparently self-serving and expect it to be accepted? But if we are honest with ourselves, the uncomfortable truth is that the machinery of excuse-making has not disappeared with time. It has simply changed its vocabulary. The man who said, "Do not put me to trial, for I fear falling into temptation before the fair-skinned women of the Romans," was using the language of his era, the concerns that would have resonated with the people around him. If that same heart existed today, it would not use those words. It would use different words, more modern words, words about mental health, about personal boundaries, about needing space, about not being ready, about waiting for the right moment. The vocabulary shifts with every century, but the underlying reality, a heart searching for permission to avoid sacrifice while still appearing acceptable to itself and to others, remains exactly the same. This is why I always encourage people to study the Seerah not as a museum piece, not as something we admire from behind glass, but as a living text that speaks directly into our present circumstances. When you read about the companions selling their belongings to fund the expedition, do not simply admire them from a distance. Ask yourself, what is the equivalent sacrifice sitting in front of me right now that I have been quietly avoiding? When you read about the man who wept because his family situation prevented him from joining, do not simply feel moved by his emotion and move on. Ask yourself, do I feel that same ache when I am unable to do good, or do I feel secret relief? These questions are uncomfortable, and I say this with full awareness that it is uncomfortable, because growth in faith rarely comes from comfortable reflection. It comes from the kind of honest self-examination that makes us slightly uneasy, that forces us to admit things about ourselves we would rather not admit. There is another angle to this story that deserves our attention, and it concerns how quickly a small compromise can grow into a pattern of self-deception. Notice that the hypocrites did not begin their journey into hypocrisy with grand betrayals. It began with small accommodations, small moments where they told themselves it was acceptable to bend the truth slightly, to prioritize their own comfort just this once, to assume that Allah would understand their particular circumstance as an exception to the rule. Over time, these small accommodations calcified into a pattern so entrenched that by the time Tabuk arrived, lying to the Messenger of Allah ﷺ himself, and by extension to Allah, felt almost natural to them. This should terrify us in the best possible way, because it means that hypocrisy of this kind rarely announces itself with a dramatic entrance. It creeps in quietly through small justifications that feel harmless in the moment, until one day we find that constructing excuses has become second nature to us, a reflex rather than a conscious choice. The lesson here is to guard the small moments as fiercely as we guard the large ones, because the large failures of faith are almost always preceded by a long series of small unexamined compromises. I also want to draw your attention to something remarkable about how the sincere believers responded, not just in their willingness to march, but in the manner of their giving. We are told that some companions came forward with contributions that seemed almost disproportionate to what they possessed, giving not from their surplus, but from what little remained after their own needs were met. This is a crucial distinction, because charity from abundance, while good, does not carry the same weight as charity from scarcity. When a person gives from what is left over after their own comfort has been secured, there is little personal cost involved. But when a person gives from what they themselves need, when the sacrifice actually touches their own well-being, that is when generosity becomes a true test of faith. The companions who marched to Tabuk did not simply give money they would not miss. Many of them gave in ways that meant hardship for their own households, trusting that Allah would provide for what remained. This kind of trust, the willingness to give even when giving hurts, is precisely the opposite spirit of the excuse-making we have been discussing. One heart says, I will hold on to what I have and find a reason to justify it. The other heart says, I will release what I have and trust Allah with the outcome. Tabuk placed these two dispositions side by side so starkly that no honest observer could mistake one for the other. It is also worth remembering that the difficulty of this expedition was not only physical. It was psychological in a way that many of the earlier battles had not been. In previous engagements, the Muslims often fought closer to home, with the possibility of returning quickly, with terrain that was at least somewhat familiar. Tabuk demanded an extended absence from families, businesses, and the security of Medina itself, all while facing an enemy whose reputation for military strength was formidable. This meant that every single day of the march, doubt had ample opportunity to creep into even sincere hearts. And yet, despite this prolonged exposure to uncertainty, despite having so many days and nights during which second thoughts could take root, the sincere companions did not turn back. Their commitment did not weaken with time. If anything, the shared hardship strengthened the bond between them and deepened their reliance upon Allah. This tells us something important about the nature of sincere faith. It does not simply survive the initial moment of difficulty. It endures through prolonged difficulty, growing steadier rather than shakier as the trial extends. There is one final thread I want to weave into this before we move forward, because I believe it ties everything together. Notice that Allah did not merely rebuke the hypocrites and leave the matter there. He also praised, in the clearest terms, those who had struggled against their own weakness and still came forward. Among the companions were men who genuinely wrestled with hardship, who felt the pull of comfort just as strongly as anyone else, and yet who overcame that pull through sheer determination and reliance upon Allah. Their names are remembered not because they were free of struggle, but because they refused to let struggle become an excuse. This is perhaps the most hopeful part of this entire lesson for those of us listening today. None of us are free of the pull toward comfort. None of us are immune to the whisper that tells us to wait, to rest, to let this particular sacrifice pass us by this time. The difference between the sincere believer and the hypocrite was never that one felt the pull and the other did not. The difference was in what each of them did with that pull. One silenced it and pressed forward. The other surrendered to it and dressed the surrender in respectable language. This is the choice that stands before every one of us today. In every circumstance that asks something difficult of our faith, and it is a choice we are given the chance to make again and again. For as long as Allah grants us breath, let this be the standard we hold ourselves to. Not the standard of appearing faithful when it costs us nothing, but the standard of the companions who sold what little they had, who wept because they could not do more, who marched despite thirst, despite distance, despite fear of the mightiest army of their age, simply because their hearts belonged to Allah before they belonged to comfort. That is sincerity. That is the difference between faith on the tongue and faith in the heart. And that is the first and perhaps the most enduring lesson that Tabuk leaves with every one of us, in every generation, for as long as this story continues to be told.